Are you a pressure group or a pressure valve? We agree with opening government. It's highly unlikely that many of these parties are going to win massive electoral swathes. However, what is actually the consequence that's created on their side is by being combative, not only do you make it far worse in the situations where you're operating as a party by making yourself look far more unrealistic, but even if you get a sniff of power, you make it one that is actively destructive. First, I want to give some framing about why it is that you're unlikely to get power entirely, just in case there's some contestation to the OG stuff. First of all, a lot of the times, the parties that are very powerful in developing democracies are either sectarian or religious parties. Look at the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, in Egypt, or for example, the People's Party in Pakistan. To these people, to the people voting for them, what is more important to you, far more important to you than material interest, is your God and appeasing what your God thinks that is the correct idea of policy and policy implementation. And so, therefore, voting on material grounds is unlikely to be able to persuade these people. Second, you have parties of independence like the ANC in South Africa. To these people, loyalty is very important. That is to say, you feel as if even if somebody's enticing you to the other side with promises of lots and lots of spending, you say, this is the party of the people who freed me. This is the party of the people who are able to stand up to a destructive force. And so therefore, you are hardly likely to agree with them and align with them. Third, you oftentimes have right-wing parties who are far more dominant. That is to say, these are people who are propped up by industrialists who hold the keys to power. They're the ones who are able to predominantly fund the economy. These are the people who are able to make sure that you have policies such that you have coffers that you can operate from as a state. And so therefore, the most important thing to the state is to make sure that you can continue operation, and these taxable revenues are very important to you. Or you have a large degree of military power like you do in places like Pakistan or places like Myanmar, where the appeasement of military figures is very important to effective governance. Or even if not, like oftentimes these nations are also sometimes propped up by the US, that's a thing too. And so therefore, even if people want material incentives to be the dominant force that is electoral, they cannot get enough ground to be able to resist the power of industrialists, so right-wing power remains. But fourth, viability concerns are oftentimes real. If you're a nation like Pakistan on the verge of default, when Imran Khan says that everybody's going to get 10 million rupees towards their healthcare costs, you're going to say, there's no way that we can afford that. That is ridiculous. And so therefore, the kinds of viability concerns that people have around left-wing policies, note that on government bench, they need to stand toward being leftist ideologically, a big step away from the status quo, and doing things like big leftist policy programs, like massive spending and stimulus. That is likely to mean that there's large viability concerns around people being able to believe in you and believe in your party. We're not saying you don't get seats. I do think that you still get some seats on both sides, probably through both optimistic young people who like the idea of leftism and want to see change in the nation, but also rich people who want a political voice as a counterbalance to the power of the establishment, or people who just want to change from status quo. But we think that it's far greater your ability to get power when you're seen as a viable option, when you operate within the Overton window of policies that you have seen in your life and you think are actually possible, which is far more likely when you are bipartisan as opposed to when you are being hard ideologically, and so therefore step away from the existing Overton window. But secondly, cooperation makes you look like a political force that is able to be worked with, that you're able to have dialogue with, that you go into meetings to, instead of being a pressure group that says that we're going to walk out of the meetings because they will not meet our unreasonable demands. We can test that they have the power, the clout, and the appeal to win an election to cater to all demographics. So therefore, the most important question in the round is, how can you have influence? Is it acting as a pressure group, or is it acting as a counterbalancing force? The first claim we're then going to give you is that it's far more likely to get influence on our side of the house. What are the consequences of combativeness? First of all, you're seen as unreasonable because the policies are so far from the accepted fray of what's happening. Your critique is therefore easy to dismiss and step away from. Look at Jeremy Corbyn saying that the military is bad, and so therefore let's get rid of the Trident nukes. That's laughed out of the realm of parliamentary democracy. And so therefore, when you take hard ideological stances that are seen as unreasonable, it weakens the left wing, and left wing stances and critique is far, far weaker. Second of all, if you do the kind of critique that opening government explicitly stands over, you literally get banned like the National Democratic Party in El Salvador, because you're doing more calling out of historical failures and systemic failures of the government that they've done active efforts to try to conceal. But third of all, oftentimes in even nations that are active democracies like India, Pakistan, or Egypt, you have party officials getting arrested. You have funding channels getting frozen. The more combative you are, the more you make yourself a target, the more you make yourself somebody who needs to be shut down, as opposed to when you're cooperating. Given we've already told you why you get seats, why can cooperation work? First, you can cooperate in your strongest seats. Urban areas and mayoral districts like Kılıçdaroğlu had in Istanbul, even though he didn't end up winning the Turkish election, are places that you can use to be able to leverage power against them. That is to say that you still get enough seats to be able to withhold on votes. That is to say that you can still have some power against the state. But second of all, you can horse trade on policies. You can say that this policy will not pass unless you appease our certain demands, or unless you make certain concessions to us. Why is it likely that these parties need to make concessions to you? First of all, the optics of bipartisanship oftentimes improve the health of the democracy. It makes you look as if you're operating fairly. It's good for investment conditions. That is to say, even if you have that much power and that you oftentimes might do things like subdue electoral conditions, when you are making some concession to the leftist party, it probably still makes you look as if you're a working democracy. Second of all, oftentimes a lot of policies that even the dominant party does can be internally contentious. That is to say, industrialists might not like the policies that India does to appeal to the farmers, like when the BJP conceded to the farmers' protest, and so therefore you do need extra votes to get it across the line, and then therefore you concede. But third of all, to appeal to investors by looking that you're more an open party and enabling the health of your democracy. Why are these things therefore good? First of all, accountability. You stop the dominant party from going out of line. You get callouts on them to make sure that they do not go too far. But second of all, you get policies. You do get some wins on our side that are still important to the people. These are minimum gas subsidies that otherwise the state might not spend on, or a COVID support scheme and mask mandates that are adopted faster, where otherwise the state was unwilling to do so. Withholding these important seats can matter, and make sure that you incentivize state action where otherwise it would be unlikely to exist, because you weaken the party establishment on the other side to such a significant extent. I'll take closing.
So your claim is that these governments are willing to lock up their opponents the moment they're a problem. And then you also say that you can force them to pass policies that they don't want to pass. Why would they not just lock you up instead of passing policies they don't want to pass?
Because they only do that when you're so much of an ideological call out that you're actually threatening the integrity of the party. When you're calling out corruption, for example, within their high-ranking ministers. When you're just saying that maybe you should change your policy direction, far less likely that they would do that. Second claim, even if you get power, it's better to have stable transitions. First of all, a lot of the things that they ask for, even if you do get power, are massive transitions from the status quo. These are new institutions. These are massive state spending programs and bulk hiring that, for example, existed with state capitalism by Lula. It's often hard to do these kinds of things seamlessly, so you compromise on efficiency in doing them well, which makes these processes far more expensive on the coffers of an already stretched state. But second of all, you lose a lot of investor confidence with leftist positions. First of all, taking these hard left positions already scares off a lot of pro-capitalist investment, people who want to be able to reap the rewards off of developing country bond markets. Second of all, massive stimulus, for example, state capitalism from Lula, something that's already scary to a lot of investors. Third, you have fear of things like reappropriation that have happened in places like South Africa. And fourth, you fear that things like corruption will become entrenched. Why is this important? First of all, stability, I think, is the most important thing. The margin here is for a developing nation, whether a farmer in rural Brazil can put food on the table and pay for their child's school, or whether or not that's likely to be something that is lost. Vote opening opposition.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now I'd like to welcome the DPM to resume the Gov case. Here.
Hello, everyone can hear me?
Yep, all good.
Oh. So I might just be a first-year schoolie debating at 1:30 a.m., but I feel like that opening opposition speech lacked a bit of a comparative. I want to deal with that first before talking about the incumbency advantage, which makes up the bulk of our case. To begin with, the comparative. Our claim is that bipartisanship, which is their alternative, is broadly attributed as a right-wing win, even if it isn't in terms of policy. So generally speaking, both sides broadly agree that the right wing is generally more popular in these specific countries. And there are a variety of reasons that both sides broadly agree on. Often they have strongman tactics that make it popular in a post-conflict state. Often it is easy to find someone to blame their problems on, whether it be ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and often there are ethnic ties that mean they are often popular. So I agree with opening opposition. There may potentially be religious advantages in a minority of instances that mean the right-wing party has a bit of an advantage. But this is a massive concession for our side of the house, because perhaps polarization isn't ideal, but comparatively, any pursuit of bipartisanship isn't neutral. It is actively a win for the right-wing side of the house. It is giving into something that is then automatically seen that where the right-wing party wins the political debate. So that's why I think opening opposition misses the point of the round when they talk about the Overton window, because the Overton window is about things that are undisputed, things that you can't really argue about in politics. But the point is that these things you can't argue about in politics are necessarily right-wing ideals. That means the right-wing party is able to take advantage of. Our claim here is simple. No, thank you. Developing democracies have traits that mean they are developing democracies have traits that mean they are often local geographies that are often more catered to the left-wing party, even if in broad circumstances the right-wing party has a bit of a general advantage. And these include things like economic struggles that mean that welfare states are often incredibly popular. And that's why you're able to spend a massive amount in the short term in order to prop up those who are suffering from economic transition. The claim from opposition is that you're shut out of politics, often because these are often economic economically unviable policies. Now, I think this is a bit unfair. We don't have to argue that you are going to pursue impossible policy. That doesn't seem to be our burden. I think it's far more about the kind of marketing tactic associated with that policy. I don't think you're going to go for something that is literally impossible for you to pass in government. But I think there is a variety of non-economic policy that is often catered to for the left wing, such as having more redistributive programs in terms of like social capital, not necessarily in economic capital. But here's the important part of our claim. Just because these localities exist on both sides of the house, to an extent, YG agrees because he can argue you have horse trading. Just because they exist doesn't mean these are powerful localities. You need aggressive marketing on our side of the house that is necessary to actually mobilize these groups, which perhaps both sides concede exist. So maybe you get horse trading on that. Maybe both sides want some level of horse trading. But how do you get that horse trading? You need people to come out in the vote. You need people to protest in the streets, to make sure that your political party is actually something that is seen as important in the state of parliament. So maybe these groups exist, but they are not something that is politically popular or powerful on their side of the house. Now, I think the best response from opposition is something along the lines of, you will literally get shut down, perhaps to the extent of being banned as a political party altogether. Now, the first thing I'll note is that I think this is broadly unlikely. Like, you're relatively high, this is relatively high risk for the government in power because this sparks a massive amount of public outrage. It makes it really difficult for you to do so, particularly in a developing democracy where you want to give the idea, you want to have an air of legitimacy as though you are a new legitimate power in government, not just to your domestic base, but also to an international government, the international organizations which want to recognize you as a valid government. But also just intuitively, if the right wing is, but intuitively, I think this is a case for our side, because if the right wing is incredibly aggressive to the point of potentially banning you, I think you have to be relatively aggressive in the way of fighting back. I think if the right wing is able to like potentially ban you, there's no reason as to why they wouldn't do so for smaller things on both sides of the house. What if it's the case that one singular politician steps out of line? I don't think this is something you can, that's something that could happen on both sides of the house. That's what you need, is more coordinated attack on the right wing establishment. All of this is to point out that you need specifically an aggressive tactic in order to mobilize your minority base. And even if you are able to pursue some level of bipartisanship, that bipartisanship is actively a win for the right wing side of the house, because that is where they have their advantage. The second part of the speech will be specifically to talk about your incumbency advantage. But before that, I'll take the POI.
There's some mythical fine line you have between stepping away from status quo policies such that you can mobilize aggressively without being seen as unrealistic and naive. Where does this exist?
Just about every single left-wing policy that says you need to have some level of redistribution, but not without blowing up the bank. Like, I think these policies exist, and even though, you know, I'm moderately right-wing as well, I can happily concede that these policies exist, even if I'm not like the biggest fan of them. Okay, the state of developing democracies means that there is a massive incumbency advantage. And to be clear, if you are one of the early political parties in power, you just get a variety of extra benefits that don't exist in other typical democracies. These look like establishing patronage networks or shaping institutions to your power. And to be clear, this is massively useful for public perception because you are now seen as the default. Any move away from this, to the alternative political party means that you will struggle because of the transition. And so it is often seen as a mistake. So often this is actually a massive political advantage, often massive political benefit to you if you actually lose the next election, because you now can say, look at the other political party, they just won. Look at how difficult that was. You should return to the default, which is our side of the house. To be clear, this is why the incumbency advantage is something that we emphasize from first, and there are three implications to this. First, if it is the case, as widely conceded, that the right wing will often be in power, you need to aggressively call this out, or you will increasingly fall behind to this incumbency advantage. The right wing can continuously blame issues on the state of the country and not on the state of, as opposed to blaming their own policy. I.e., they can say it is not our economic policy that is struggling, but rather that as a country we are struggling as to recover from post-conflict. And that's why opening opposition is wrong when they say the right, we're able to challenge right-wing issues bipartisanship-wise, because that can always, you can never challenge it because it can always be opposed as some other abstract issue with the state as a whole, not with the party. The second implication is, even if it is the case that the left wing is able to get into power, you need to maximize these benefits yourself. Presumably on both sides of the house, there is a moderate probability that you actually do get into power. There's just so many factors outside of your control. I don't think either side can really reasonably predict this. But this incumbency advantage exists far more on our side of the house compared to being limited on their side, because you have to unnecessarily compromise instead of furthering that edge and making sure you stay in power for the next couple of decades. You should demonize the alternative when you are in power to maximize the incumbency advantage and maintain your regime. But third and most finally, there is a middle ground here, as I'm happy to concede. Some developing democracies do have some coalition or shared governments, whether it be naturally originated or enforced by international government. But I agree with opening opposition here that horse trading in politics is good, but horse trading works as a form of negotiation. You give up something for something in return. You don't have anything to give up if you don't pursue this aggressive thing. You don't have a political party to mobilize and say these people will vote for you and stop protesting if you give us this policy. You don't have have a policy to say, I'll give up this policy if you give up your policy. That doesn't exist on your side of the house if you don't pursue something aggressive. As per all the prior argumentation as to why bipartisanship is actually a win for their side of the house. For all of these reasons, very proud to propose. Cheers.
Well, I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I would like to welcome the DLO to wrap up the top half here.
Can I check audible?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. First, I'm going to explain why you're unlikely to get into power on their side at all. Secondly, even if you do somehow manage to get into power, why this is something that will be short-term and you will fall out of it immediately. But on the first thing, opening government, and I want to be clear, is going quite hardline in the way that they are modeling this debate. They are saying that they're going to be demonizing right-wing parties. They are going to be refusing to arrive to any sort of compromise. They even acknowledge that the right wing might have an edge in those developing democracies, and they have powerful networks that they are working with, which is something that we thought that we might be having to prove. What we do also add is that often you have powerful militaries that are connected to incumbent parties. You often have powerful oligarchs or industrial networks and similar things that are currently in line with the parties that are in power. What we explain is that this is precisely what would get you likely banned or extremely demonized against at the point when you decide to demonize those parties and those networks. Zach's response to this is that it is costly to be trying to ban or crack down upon parties. The issue is that they are clearly stepping over the line, right? Listen to what they are saying. They are suggesting that they're going to be demonizing the party, demonizing alongside of it the military, which is presumably one of the institutions that has the biggest power to crack down upon you, demonizing the current economic the networks of power that exist in those countries. That is precisely why you are likely to get banned. But why are you more likely to get into power on the comparative? What we said is that there probably is some degree of appeal of left-leaning policies. That is that you probably have people who might have some interest in more stimulus, redistribution, more progressive social policy, etc. The reason why you are much more likely to have some sort of success is because you are comparatively substantially less threatening. That is because we are not demonizing the incumbent parties and the network that come with them. That is when it comes to the powerful industries or the military, we are cooperating with them. We are guaranteeing some sort of broad continuum of that while shifting the policies somewhat to the left. This has several consequences. The first one is just we probably have more people being able to vote for us in the first place. That is, there are probably a solid number of voters who might be pro the left-leaning policies and the program, but as Baji explains, might have, for example, some kind of loyalty to the pre-existing parties because they are pro-independence parties, or they have some loyalty towards the establishment, or they don't want very drastic changes. Those are the types of people, the more moderate people that we would get voting for us on our side. On their side, they can appeal on the most radical small groups. They are unlikely to get voted in, even if they do not get banned. But secondly, you are likely to be allowed to get some degree of power. Perhaps you can sit in the parliament rather than be banned, so you can do things like horse trading. Like, obviously, you can horse trade if you are in the parliament because, like, you can be promising to vote for something or not vote for something in exchange for something else. But also, you might sometimes even get positions in the government, right? It's just in the Philippines, the things that is regularly happen when the opposition representative does get some degree of power to appease both of the voter bases and is able to actually pass policies. This means that A, we are actually able to hold these parties accountable in the way that OG wants to. We are not doing it through demonizing. Perhaps we are not doing it to such drastic extent as they want to, but we can at least do it to some extent. But secondly, we are actually able to get something passed. And that is because then, and a result of it is that you are seen as more reasonable and more feasible. And this is crucial, right? Because this is important to build up any chances to get elected more and get more voter bases in the future. Precisely because, as Zach explains, you need to overcome the incumbent advantage. You need to be seen as someone who's proposing feasible things in order to be able to ever to get voted in. We can obviously still claim that the policies were on our platform if something gets passed. I'm not sure how much like discursive power this incumbent party has that they can claim everything that we said. It's clearly like the initial proposition on our side. This is comparative. I don't want to let opening government claim that we are non-comparative. If you are not demonizing, Zach's claim is correct. There is high costs to shutting you down. Like banning opposition parties, it is true, is quite bad optics, right? You don't want to be dealing with some sort of protests coming from it, some loss of confidence, some kind of international backlash. This means that you don't want to do it unless you actually have to. And the point when you have to is when the military and the oligarchs are worried because you are demonizing them throughout the entire election processes. And when you are saying that you're going to radically change how the state functions as a result. This means that on their side, that is something that is likely to happen. On our side, precisely, you are doing the cost-benefit calculus when you are more likely to be given power as opposed to crack down upon. Before I talk about this stability, does CJ have anything?
What you're saying is that the oligarchs are marginally more likely to support you if you don't antagonize them. The problem is on neither side do they have an incentive to support you if the right wings are already in power.
Okay, so like, yes, of course, they would obviously want to prefer the right wing to be to stay in power, right? But to the degree that you have some kind of support, which opening government agrees, we agree that there is some support for the left-wing parties and policies. If you end up getting some power, then obviously they are much more likely to let you be in and cooperate if you are not explicitly demonizing and you're willing to cooperate, as opposed to if you are saying, if you are demonizing them as OG proposes, then of course you don't want them to have any power whatsoever. I think this makes sense. I hope it's reasonable. I hope it's not incoherent. Then secondly, even if you do get some power, why this power is unsustainable. The issue with the ideologically rigid left-wing parties getting into power is twofold. The first one is that the policies often practically just are unsustainable, as Vaji explains. But more importantly, and this is the claim that Zach doesn't deal with, these policies are perceived as practically unsustainable, which leads to a loss of confidence. The consequence of it is that at best, if a random election success occurs, at best it's a short-term benefit and you get voted out immediately after. Because what you are looking at, often with left-leaning parties, is that you have fear of policies such as land reforms, expropriation, or redistribution programs that lead to mass stimulus and increase of debt. Even if it would not happen in reality, that is the perception that you have when this transition of power occurs. Meaning that preemptively, you would probably have things like loss in investor confidence, loss of FDI coming into your country, because you have perception of instability precisely because your entire election platform was radical overhaul of what the incumbent party stood for. On our side, you see as more of a continuation, so you actually could get things passed. For all those reasons, proud to vote.
Cool. I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech and for a great top off. I'd now like to welcome the member of government whenever you're ready.
I like XK. I also have a preference for people to keep their video on. You don't have to, but it's nice if people do. And you can raise your hand to POI or put it in the chat. Just don't unmute yourself. Okay. We'll start. Okay. There are two quick points of framing I want to use to set up this debate. The first one is this debate is about right now. It's not about every emerging country and it's not about every time period. It's about moving in a certain direction relative to a certain starting point that exists right now, and we don't have to argue that this movement is permanent because political ties come and go. It's about the current circumstance. The second thing is we're going to prove this on balance. And note that not all developing countries are democracies. I don't think that Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood is a democracy. Sorry, OG. India, for example, with 1.3 billion people, is a democracy. And it's actually the majority of people in developing countries who live in democracies in the world live in just that one country. If we win India, we probably won this debate. We're going to show that this makes sense for most people. It's not going to matter in every single case. Our extension and our stance is very simple. This is the right answer to the specific and present challenge of right-wing populism that exists in emerging countries. It will not always be the case. Democracy is currently in retreat in these countries, especially in the developing world. Historically, there have been right-wing parties that agree with left-wing parties on their goals, but disagree on how they want to get there. The BJP in India in the early 2000s was focused on moving towards a more capitalist economy in India, but still agreed with India's constitution, which wanted a secular, multicultural democracy. The conservative governments in Eastern Europe in the 90s were focused on creating a more capitalist country after the Soviet Union, but everyone agreed that the Soviet Union had to go. Right now, things are fundamentally different because parties on the right wing are rising due to fundamental anger about changes in society. I think two good examples of this are globalization, where this has caused huge swings in things like inflation in places like Latin America. This has led to the rise of leaders like Milei in Argentina, who believe that we should not be participating in a global economic system. They believe in things like the US and the World Trade Organization being fundamentally wrong, and they want to change the direction of the society. And second, things like mass migration and geopolitical fissures that have divided societies on ethnic or racial lines. So I think India is the textbook case of this, where there's a huge fissure between Hindu nationalists and Muslims, or Hindus who don't believe in a kind of religious nationalism, or Orban in Hungary was kind of the first person to do this, and his unique brand of racism against migrants into Europe has kind of created an entire brand of populism in Central and Eastern Europe. I think that's the vast majority of populism right now. The key point is these people see a subset of society to blame for the problems of their overall country. They don't agree about the direction society needs to move in, and they believe that they need to stand up very strongly to fundamental forces that are changing the way that the world works. This usually leads to the election of people who say, we are being bullied by the rest of the world. We need to be very, very strong in confronting and crushing our enemies and stand up to these interest groups. I think OO and OG actually agree to this, that we're witnessing a tide of strongmen leaders all around the world. Our claim is sucking up to strongmen, as OO suggests, does not make them less cruel to you, and the moment you become inconvenient to them, they will crush you. What you need to do is to build strength in numbers so that it's politically impossible for them to crush you. There are two reasons why sucking up to them won't work. The first one is these parties have very strong cults of personality that develop within them, and they are rewarded for ideological purity, not the reasonableness of their policy, specifically because they optimize for a politics of blame, where if they get the specific implementation of their policy wrong, there is always someone they can blame for being ineffective. They can blame immigrants, they can blame the US, they can blame globalization. But if they are not too extreme, there will always be an extreme faction who will come for them, who says that because they are sucking up to the people that they are blaming, they are losing, and that if you would just back the more extreme faction, you see this in every single country I've just discussed, you will get the outcome that you want. This is the reason why Republicans in the House are blocking an immigration bill that gives them every single thing that they want, because they say cooperating with the Democrats is still worse than going to bat for our guy Donald Trump. So our point is, as soon as you are able to get these people to do something of substance, the very far right will come after the moderate right and will probably gain leverage vis-a-vis them, which makes it in the incentive for the moderate right to crush you, to lock you up, and not to cooperate with you. The reason why the strategy that OO laid out is not going to work, therefore, is because the left is currently less powerful than the far right is in these countries, and so you will always lose to them. The second reason why sucking up doesn't work is it's very hard to sell yourself as a coherent alternative by just advocating for the same thing, but like a little bit less bad. You're seen as ingenuine by people on the right when you flip-flop, and so moderates are not going to pick you over the right wing if they agree with the right wing on the issues. They will pick the people who said it first. This is why Democrats got clobbered in 2004 when they ran on the Iraq war is fine, but we would just do it better, but came back in 2008 by saying the Iraq war was a fucking mistake. But on top of that, you fracture your base internally because the people who make up like 80% of your support actually fundamentally disagree with the right wing. They think that the right wing is abridging things like human rights, like crushing Muslims in India. They think that these people are evil and are actually destroying the fabric of society. And when you cooperate with them, they have no reason to invest their time or energy in your cause. You are losing a much larger core of your support than what you get from these moderates. Our alternative is a lot better. There's two things we would do on CG. The first one is we would get these people on corruption. People right now agree with the right wing on the issues, but these parties are also creating other problems. They're tending to trample on democracy. Everyone agrees that they might be jailing their opponents, that they might be interfering in elections or taking away press freedoms. The thing is, the proven and effective strategy against parties of this kind is not to say that you would do the same thing, but just a little bit better. It's to say that these people are corrupt criminals and that we will never work with them because they are criminals until somebody else is in charge. People generally care about democracy in these countries, regardless of whether their issues are winning. They have fought hard for building democratic institutions over generations, and they don't want to see them go. And so when these parties start to do corrupt things, it is a very powerful strategy for you to say that you are against that corruption. Last chance for a POI.
So presumably, if you are mobilizing against a strawman who is crushing democracy, as you say, they lock you up before you get the strength in numbers. How about you are convenient first, and then it's far harder to lock you up?
My response to this is when they lock you up, you can stage opposition to that. There were mass demonstrations in Israel when Netanyahu tried to pack the courts. Lula won an election from prison in Brazil, even though people agreed with the right wing on fundamental issues like burning down the Amazon, because when you jail these people, they become martyrs. What you need to do is build a massive base around the fact that democracy itself is under threat and that the only way to stop it is to kick the right wing out. And even if it takes longer, what we have shown historically is that the large amount of support you're able to get around just protecting the political system that we have is much, much larger than the right wing can put back in the bottle. The second thing we would do on our side, though, is that even if it takes a long time for you to win an election, for you to prove that corruption, in the meantime, you can build strength in numbers at the local level. A lot of these countries have local and regional political parties that control individual parts of the country, like Kerala in India is controlled by communists. They have large labor unions that organize against the major corporations in those countries. You can still organize your base a lot better when you stick to core and fundamental issues and eke out smaller and local level wins that prove that your party actually has something to offer to people. The moment that you start cooperating with people who are taking away human rights and are corrupt, you don't have the credibility to build the base with the people who have been committed to your cause for generations, because it's a massive betrayal. We would rather eke out wins on the local level in a way that we can guarantee and eventually get these people on corruption than cross our fingers that strongmen will treat us better. Very proud.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Reminder to please stick to 7 minutes 15. I will stop tracking afterwards. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the member of opposition. Here.
I prefer visual POIs, so you can just wave your hand or put something in the chat. Either way is fine. First, a small bit of framing. I want to note very clearly, this debate is about developing democracies. It is not about developing countries with democracies. So I think a lot of the analysis that comes out about, this debate is about India just clearly doesn't apply. We're talking about countries who are building democracies up from the ground, what these sorts of countries have as characteristics, and what might be more appealing for left-wing parties that exist. I think that there are three broad important things to note about these countries. Firstly, they're often post-colonial, given current status of these countries. They've oftentimes overthrown colonial leaders, are struggling to build states. Secondly, there's a lack of strong state institutions, i.e. they do not have the ability to engage in super strong police forces, property rights, etc., which means that building up these institutions is a strong priority of parties. Thirdly, the governments that are in power are broadly insecure. There's not a huge ton of stability that exists within these. First argument, then, is why the risk for violence gets much higher on their side of the house, and why this is likely to cause huge amounts of conflict in these countries. Why is violence likely? Firstly, because parties, as OO notes, campaign on immutable characteristics. But the important thing they miss is how these immutable characteristics operate. That is to say, these parties operate in ways that are fundamentally oppositional to each other, i.e. the Muslim Brotherhood shuts out anyone who is not Sunni. The CHP in Turkey campaigns on the Islamicization of the government of the AKP, which means that the ways that these parties operate in their world are likely to be hard, and even more so, the way that these parties operate creates the forms of demonization that they talk about of other groups. Secondly, there's strong degrees of ethnic fractionalization in these countries. They oftentimes are very heterogeneous, which means that there are many ethnic groups that exist, which makes the consequences and likelihood of violence very high. Thirdly, there are minimal institutions. So the ability of police enforcement, for instance, or the ability to ensure that these sorts of conflicts don't happen in the first place are very minimal. Fourthly, I do just think that there's a lower opportunity cost to engage in violence in the first place. There's many gangs that exist in these areas because there are poor economic opportunities for people. Why does this problem get much, much worse when you do not engage in bipartisanship and instead engage and campaign on the sorts of policies that they talk about? Firstly, I think there's likely to be strong right-wing crackdowns of your party that sparks conflict, insofar as they view you as an existential threat rather than something that can be maintained and dealt with within the realm of party politics. You're likely to be cracked down in ways that are much stronger. This party is likely to get banned. Opposition leaders are likely to get assassinated in ways that I think just make it much, much worse for these leaders on their side. And I think the response that comes from opposition parties and left-wing parties is forced to be things that incite violence. And even if it's not the party leaders on our side, it's the people who believe in the party's ideology that are likely to begin that violence in the first place. Secondly, I think the sorts of leaders that you get become more extreme on their side because you have to lean on populism, personality politics, demonization of the other to get into power in the first place. Whereas on our side, you are much more able to campaign on the sorts of material conditions that people have and why these problems are not being solved by the right-wing government, why policies are a better way to achieve it. Thirdly, the messaging becomes life or death. I think Devesh gives you a very good example of what this looks like. That is to say, democracy will only work if we do it, and if you don't get us into power, our party will never cease to exist. We will never be successful. This sort of messaging creates the sort of violent outcomes that create the harms that exist in the first place. We're much more likely to lead into violent forms of conflict that exist. We're going to create that form of recruitment. Why does bipartisanship solve this? Firstly, I think it makes it much more likely that you are able to stabilize these governments. You are able to ease some of the tensions that exist on our side, which I think just means that these parties are more willing to work together. They might have disagreements on ethnic lines, but they are less likely to have this bleed into whether violent conflict occurs in the first place. Secondly, I think that there's just high degrees of disaffection with the legacies of conflicts that probably exist in these societies, which means that the campaigns that you operate on then do not deal with the levels of strongman leaders that these countries have been dealing with for decades, means that the sorts of campaigning that you have works. I want to weigh this above the OO content because I think that they make arguments as to why this leads to loss of foreign direct investment, loss of institutions, etc. But I think it is just much worse if you create all-out civil wars in these areas, that these sorts of things happen more often on their side. I think violent conflict creates capital fight much more than changes in party politics. Violent conflict is the thing that is going to most likely create the sorts of massive political destruction of political institutions. You're less likely to get courts, political institutions, etc. But I also think this just kills tons of people, and I posit that that is probably a higher burden of these parties who are aiming to represent their people, aiming to ensure that these countries stabilize in the long term. I'll take that POI.
So your claim is that calling out these governments correctly as corrupt is bad because that will cause people to throw like Molotov cocktails at them? That's your case?
I don't think that this is the case. You can still call out problems that exist in these governments and still work with them. You can note corruption when it exists, but you can also work with them on certain policies. On your side, you necessarily have to demonize them entirely, refuse to work with them in ways that create the ethnic conflict, that make it life or death. Whereas on our side, you can say that leaders are corrupt, but also continue to engage in negotiations with them. I think this is examples of like what occurs in Turkey now. Second thing I want to prove. OO says that you are going to get the people who will already vote for you, but there's no analysis on why you are more likely to get these parties in power, why they're more likely to convince voters, etc. First thing I want to prove is why there's a margin for change. They say that there's tons of, like, the people who exist are static, opposition is going to be the opposition no matter what, and authoritarian governments are going to accommodate you somewhat. I think this is somewhat untrue. I think it is likely that you are going to be able to get some degree of voters that exist, which I think they concede to later. And I think the reason for this is that there's large degrees of ideological fatigue in these areas. That is to say, people are tired of strongman leaders. They're tired of extremist rhetoric. They're done with killing their neighbors back and forth and want to move on and build a society that is better off for the people that live in it. The Bosnian Muslims want to get along with the Serbians. They're tired of the constant killings that occurred. And I think in particular, they're tired because the regimes of the past did not accomplish anything to save their material conditions, to help their material conditions. And I think that it is just better on our side that you are able to gravitate towards these people and encourage them to work. How do we convince people? Firstly, because you're seen as more reasonable. You can ease sort of the past strife that we talk about, the ethnic lines that have existed, and say that we are not entirely oppositional to you as a kind, but that we were willing to work with you generally. Secondly, is that you build a comparative advantage. You can shift all of the people that have shifted towards apoliticism, you are able to mobilize on our side, whereas on their side, they're not able to access them. Thirdly, is that you just create a better platform. Because figuring out what bipartisan means is that you have to do the kinds of research to understand what people on the ground want, which means that the sorts of policy issues you get on our side are likely to be better. Very proud to oppose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now I would like to welcome the government whip to wrap up the Gov case. Here.
Hello, I take POIs visually. If you cannot turn your camera on and wave, just unmute and say POI. I'm kind of ambivalent between OO and CO at this point. And please have your cameras on if possible. When a corrupt, bloated right-wing party is forced to pull out the gun, send the police onto the street, and force down thousands of protesters who come up to support your cause, this is not a reason to give up on the years of progress that have culminated in this kind of widespread support. This is a victory, and it is imperative that we continue to push through. The very point of a left-wing party existing isn't to stand around holding right-wing parties accountable and, I don't know, representing people doing policy research. The point is to represent millions of people who want the exact opposite thing of what the right-wing party is doing. And your point is to fight for a zero-sum game, that is to get into power. No matter what, a right-wing party is going to want to push you down and crack down on you if you get closer to success. But it is your mission to push through this kind of opposition and win regardless. CO's case is on violence. 4 responses. 1. Violence, great, completely necessary in any emerging fragile democracy in order to overthrow the authoritarian government. And the simple reason for this is like the point of it being an emerging democracy that's kind of fragile is that the executive is going to be tempted to abuse their power. And what's the most easy way to respond to a bunch of protesters? Just use the police. And then from then, it's a very, very thin line towards kind of like having broader, more violent crackdowns. The point of this is to say that violence is kind of inevitable when you have success more generally. What we would say is we really strongly support this. 1, because it's really fucking expensive for the central government. You pay salaries for a massively expanded police force. You have to pay for fucking like smoke bombs and grenades. It's an unsustainable policy. You can't keep it up forever, especially not when you have so many people out on the streets. But number 2, you also burn through goodwill. The generals don't have fun like sending out their soldiers to potentially like risk their lives and die on the battlefield. When I'm like a centrist and I see my right-wing government being yelled at constantly by everyone else, I'm not that inspired by faith that they're the party that's going to lead me to success. Every day that you force the government to fight against you is a day that they come closer to crumbling, and the point at which you build a stronger case for your success in the future. Number 2, I also think they've just vastly exaggerated their claims of violence. Like, guys, colonialism means ethnic divide, means obviously there's going to be mass like slaughter. It's just not good enough in terms of analysis. There's just no marginal like claim on what the change is coming from CO. What we would say is that there is just enormous international pressure in a really interconnected world. Like Bangladesh is the best example, right? Which is like Bangladesh has been fucked by LNG prices going up, which means that they've gone into tons of debt, which has been appreciating hugely in value. What that means is they're reliant on IMF loans in order to pay back, like to fund their government to keep things going. What that means is that they have to concede to conditions that oversee corruption, for example, constrain the extent to which you're able to artificially manipulate your interest rates, and that also makes it impossible for the government to be extremely abusive in terms of violence. This is just an example of the various ways in which autocratic governments are still dependent, or like governments of developing democracies, like this is semantic, relying on international goodwill, and which is why you don't get the manslaughter that they're talking about. But number 3, just again, like eyes on the prize, guys, like we're willing to bite the bullet and concede that some people are going to pass away in the in the process of this motion happening. But that is not the debate. Like, this debate is specifically about the interest of a left-wing party. The reason why the left-wing party should care more about electoral success than about protests and death is because, frankly, people die because of poverty. People die because the right-wing party continues to support economic segregation every single day. Just because it's a quieter death doesn't mean it's any less important. We just genuinely perceive our ability to enter office as the most important thing over everything else. And finally, because we think that having a lot of transition between right-wing and left-wing governments is the best way to limit any one government's ability to control the military, and therefore the best way to control violence in the long run. CO is dead in the water. Let's go to OO. They have a very generic case, which is left-wing policies are too extreme. You need to pursue bilateralism to portray yourself as viable candidates to voters and to appease oligarchs, the military, and investors. Few responses. The first thing is, this is not about whether you like them, whether people like you more or less in a vacuum. It's about whether or not the change in terms of how much they like you is sufficient to make them like you more than the right wing. And the problem is that the thing about viability and economic success is just the exact same metric as right-wing governments are often relying on. No, thank you. And this is not enough because you have a shorter history of doing this that right-wing governments do. For example, you're still forced to have some rhetoric that is left-wing, I assume, since you don't betray your beliefs absolutely completely. But also, like, they say some people are going to vote for you. Like, who? Like, if you're an oligarch, if I'm a fucking finance bro in Bangladesh, like, I'm still going to want the right-wing government in power because I don't want to pay higher taxes. They say that we just gain small extremist groups. Like, this is completely assertive and not true. The demographic structure of developing countries that often align closely with developing democracies is also one where you have a large, like, lower income class, which is also therefore the set of people that Waji is talking about in the beginning of their speech. Your own characterization about how practicality is less important than your relationship with God or ideology or loyalty is the exact reason why viability doesn't matter. The reason why left-wing populism is so popular and successful is because I don't care about the success of this policy, because my life as a very low-income person is kind of divorced from what economic policies have up top in my view. What I care more is whether the politician claims to be aligned and sympathetic to my woes and concerns. So
you don't get the thousands of protesters in the first place. In your extreme crooked strongman countries, you get nicked in the butt the moment you first start demonizing, especially if left is nascent and small and not established, as you just said.
This is just the same POI you gave to Vesh, and I think that he responded to it better than I could. Okay, the final response then is on how their dialogue retreated to the worst case scenario. Like, oh, but we get like some power, right? Guys, like, who cares? Like, there's no explanation of the impact of this whatsoever. Even if you have some power, making yourself toothless as a result of pursuing bilateralism means that this isn't really in your own interest for 3 reasons. The first reason is because you compromise on your ability to push for more aggressive policy as a result of trying to gain the approval of the dominant party. Number 2, if your strat is dependent on setting yourself as cooperative and being pragmatic, this makes you completely reliant on the goodwill of the incumbent parties, like a willingness to say that you're doing a good job to retain success, for example. But finally, because this is also contingent on you having an increase in support in the first place. We explained to you why the voter base that you care about is responded only to corruption allegations, for example. We prove a much larger actual increase in support, and that's kind of necessary condition to gain both short-term electoral success in the case of flagrant corruption, also long-term voter base construction.
Cool. I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and now I'd like to welcome the output to wrap up the debate here.
Can you give me like 15 seconds to grab my charger from upstairs?
Go for it.
Apologies. Thank you for waiting. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. As much as CG wants to make this a debate about how is it best to overthrow an authoritarian government, I think they forget what the motion is actually about. Presumably, this occurs in countries where there are new democracies, where there's an incentive of international organizations and domestic actors on the ground to, at least in the initial stages of that democracy, preserve a realm of legitimacy. The question then becomes not who can get more intensity from a smaller number of supporters, but who can actually get people showing up to the ballot box in numbers, who can actually get a majority of their voter base to believe in the message that they're saying, and who can best get these people to engage in positive ways that do not foster increased amounts of violence. So even though XK responds to the part of our extension that says violence might be likely, they do not actually respond to our mechanisms about how you actually create a better message in the first place. This extension is really, really important because OO's argument looks like this. You have an existing supporter base. That supporter base is likely to vote for some number of people in the short term, and that is good because these people can create policies that have a moderating effect. But our argument has a far larger impact. That is, we tell you why you're able to convince a far larger swath of median voters that would not have voted for you in the otherwise because you establish a comparative advantage. Why is this the case? What Nas tells you is, number one, because you want to be bipartisan, you have an incentive to not just rely on the outdated rhetoric of the past, of what previous left-wing parties did, but you have an incentive to go on the ground and figure out what the average voter actually cares about. So if it is the case that Devesh tells you that corruption is something that a vast majority of people can resonate with, this is the exact reason why on our side of the house, this is the kind of bipartisan issue that you're likely going to be advocating for. But second, you also talk about this in vastly different ways. That is, the way you package your policy becomes a lot different, which is what Nas tells you. So instead of calling for a rise to arms because the other party is the demon, you do things like say, we can cooperate with them to create a path forward. But thirdly, and most importantly, given that all sides agree that most people are tired of strongmen politicians, are tired of extreme rhetoric, the only way you can differentiate yourself is by not relying on these same mechanisms that failed the people in the past, that failed them in the prior authoritarian regimes, that failed them when their people were plagued by violence, by the kinds of civil wars that they just left in order to create these new kinds of democracies. This is the only way you can actually widen your voter base, and this is the only way you can actually establish the kind of comparative advantage for you to be able to win the number games in the long run. Now then, I want to respond to CG. So what CG tells us is, where's my CG paper? Okay, what CG tells us is, this is extremely historically specific, and then this is the reason why we need to make sure that we incentivize people in very strong ways. Firstly, I just want to contest their framing, which I think Nas does in the first place. Like, number one, I think we can just significantly marginalize the kinds of impacts they're able to access when we just say that the kinds of countries they're talking about are probably not actually the most of countries within the scope of this debate. That is, they do not win India because this motion is probably about countries like the Philippines or like Chile or Poland that are just establishing democracies from the ground up. So it's not the case that one strongman leader has been able to have a huge grasp of these countries over many, many years, or one party has won many times. That's why their own OG makes their argument about the incumbency advantage. But number two, I just think that it is probably the case that, like their OG says, these parties have an incentive to maintain the image of democracy, so they are unlikely to do the kinds of very, very extreme things that they talk about to a median party. That's why we can actually flip most of their arguments, when what Nas tells you is the only way you can crack down on an oppositional political party is if you can find a legitimate justification for that crackdown. We tell you that they create that justification when you incentivize your supporters by doing things like they tell you, calling them to arms, saying that you should have massive protests or backlash in order to try to topple the current regime. Then the current regime has a legitimate democratic excuse to jail your supporters, to say that this dissent is actually threatening the legitimacy of the democracy, to use this as a way for international organizations to not stop them when they do things like crack down on their opposition. The second thing that I want to say is I also just think that they have a mischaracterization on what kinds of issues that they can access, right? Because presumably on their side of the house, what they do is maintain the consistent, relatively extreme ideology of the left. That is, I don't think corruption is something that is exclusive to the left. It probably looks like defending the kinds of leftist economic policies or leftist social values that the top half of the debate talks about. So they need to defend these specific issues and not try to scroll out of them. But secondarily, I think I already told you about why on our side of the house, you're able to then take the things that both parties are likely to agree that should be fixed, e.g., like right-wing parties also probably do not like corruption to a certain extent, and find ways to compromise on these issues if you figure out that's what bipartisan means. But I'll take a PY from opening. Okay, closing.
This is a
Regardless of
and also a knife. Bipartisanship is not the same thing as centrism. Your OO ran that you will be collaborating with the corrupt government that's currently in power. We can run on something everyone agrees with, which is that the government is made up of criminals. We have to go to the streets and protest and kick them out. And that is not the same thing as bipartisan.
Okay, let's say both sides can access this. I think we can also just say that we package it in a way that says we are fighting corruption because this is the way that we want to move the country forward collectively, versus you are calling out a specific party as being corrupt and incentivizing your supporters to attack those specific leaders. I don't think that we're knifing our opening at all. How do we weigh over them? Number one, I think even in their best case, the kinds of policies or the kinds of actions they call for get fatigued very quickly. So maybe you can do this for one election, but it's unclear how you can use the same kind of rhetoric and messaging over time. So it becomes increasingly ineffective if you cannot be successful the first time you use it. But number two, it is extremely hard to scale up in the future. That is, we are always able to be more flexible to what the people's demands are. Whereas on their side of the house, they have to maintain the kind of extremist rhetoric that they talk about, even when it is no longer in the incentive of the political climate. And thirdly, I think I already gave you the weighing about why numbers and passive supporters are probably more important than a small number of intense supporters if these intense supporters just rile up violence in the short term but don't actually get people to vote. Finally, then on OG, I just think number one, they never prove the degree of the incumbency effect. Like they do not prove why you break this down in any meaningful way because they never actually explain how you get into office at all. And number two, they never explain how even if you get into office on their side of the house, you actually get the parties to capitulate, to collaborate on policies rather than just using you as a signaling effect that is just a sitting duck in the office itself. Very proud.
Cool. I'd like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. If you can just give me like a few minutes to go over my notes, have like a mini existential, and I will come back with a call and OA. You're welcome to stay in this room. I will just mute. So, yeah.
Thanks so much.